Mr. Derek Veenhoff, who's better known as Deke.
Drinking liquor with DJ Deke, we out laughing.
Yo, Deke.
All right. Hello, everybody out there. Welcome back to the show, the Deekast. And we're episode 79 here today with Dr. Channa Prakash. How are you, sir?
I'm very good, Derek. Thank you. Nice to be with you.
That's great. So Dr. Channa is Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Tuskegee University in Alabama. He has served on the faculty since '89, 1 year after I was born. He is a professor of crop genetics and biotechnology. His research expertise is on genetic improvements of food crops of importance to developing nations. And his lab was among the first to develop transgenic sweet potato and peanut plants, as well as conducting some of the first genomic studies on the peanut. Is all that correct, sir? Do I have that right?
Good. Yeah, you got that right.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about your origins, your background, and maybe your academic background? Yeah,
certainly. I grew up in India. You know, I was born and brought up in a city called Bangalore, India. That's right now the tech capital, the software capital of India. And in fact, my city of Bangalore has more employees in the information technology than probably more than Silicon Valley and Research Triangle Park and Route 128 put together. I majored in agriculture there, and I did my master's in genetics and plant breeding. And then I went to Australia to do my PhD in forest genetics. And then I moved to United States. I was a postdoctoral scientist at University of Kentucky for a couple of years. And then I moved to Tuskegee University, where I've been since 1989, as you mentioned. And I still teach plant biotechnology. And I helped establish one of the very first labs here on working with molecular biology and genetic engineering with crop plants.
So it's safe to say you're a big deal. You're kind of a big deal. Is that right?
My children don't think so.
Well, I think I found you on Twitter through Dr. Kevin Folta, who's been on the show a couple times.
Right.
And you just have this interesting humor and interesting lens on everything. And you talk a lot of sometimes about pop culture references, and you tweet a lot of interesting articles and that. So a couple I wanted to ask you about before we get into more of the general stuff. But so some of your recent tweets, you just tweeted about this raspberry racket, about export fraud and raspberries coming from China to Chile to Canada. What is the background there on that story?
Yeah, that's a very interesting story that was published just yesterday, I think. And this is about how an investigation in Canada uncovered organic raspberries that was seemingly coming from Chile, and it was packed in Chile and it was labeled in Chile. But when they found out that it was being grown all over in China, and it was being shipped all the way to South America, where they were repackaging and rebranding it and then shipping it to Canada. It just shows that a lot of us are not really aware as to how much fraud that occurs. And I've heard that much of olive oil, for instance, that what we get here, even in the supermarkets, is not olive oil at all. And that was kind of surprising to a lot. But an interesting twist to this raspberry story is that it's not just, just getting away with a false label. There was a serious incidence of viral diarrhea due to norovirus, the cruise ship diarrhea that we hear often. The sickness that was quite rampant in Canada in 2017, and although it was not it was not fully linked to this raspberry, there is a suspicion that these raspberries, especially those that are termed organic. They tend to use a lot of manure, and if they're not sterilized properly, they can get into a fecal matter, can get into your produce, and can cause a lot of harm. And we hear that quite often in organic produce. And so that was kind of a very interesting story that came out yesterday.
Right. So even when we think we're tracking down exactly where our food may come from, we are still susceptible to other fraud or errors, things that we don't necessarily know about or can't know about to some degree.
Yes, certainly, and that's why there is lot more consciousness about where our food comes from, and there's a lot of questions that the general consuming public ask these days.
Yes. So what is in general, what is biotech? I know it's a broad term. And what should the average person know or understand about agriculture and biotech in 2020?
Well, I think for an average person, they need to understand that this was a technology that was developed in the early 80s, and it was deployed for the first time in the middle of 1990s. And we have these technology, and there are a variety of tools that this technology provides, but the most important one is so-called genetically modified organisms, or GM crops, that have tend to have become controversial in the past few years, but much of that is because of the misinformation and misperception on this technology. Agriculture biotechnology, the so-called GM crops, have been grown on literally and hundreds of millions of acres every year, and we have almost 30 countries who plant these crops, and we have had a very safe history of their use. When you develop a GM crop variety, it goes through a tremendous amount of testing for its safety, its impact on human health, its impact on livestock health, and its impact on the environment. And no other food product or agriculture product is tested as much as these GM crops are. And not just here in the United States or Canada, or Brazil, Argentina, where they're mostly produced, but also in all the importing countries, like European Union is one of the biggest consumers of these GM products. And despite its success, there is a lot of doubts in the mind of the public. A lot of it's orchestrated by groups that are opposed to this technology. And just today, we heard a Nobel Prize was given to two women who developed an amazing technique called CRISPR, gene editing. While it was developed in the microorganism, in the bacteria, in its defense against virus, which happens naturally. And much of the really amazing application of this technique is in curing human diseases. Already it's being used to treat sickle cell anemia on an experimental basis. There's a lot of application of this technology in agriculture too. And so by being open-minded about this technology, I think the society can realize a lot of benefits. And by mindlessly opposing technology, I think we're denying the benefits of this technology, especially to developing countries where I think it can matter a lot.
Is that a bit of a in the Western world, we have a bit of a privilege, so to speak, or a blindness to the developing nations where we may criticize something because we have the ability to and still live a normal life, but where in a developing nation, they may heavily rely on something that we might criticize that they actually really need.
Absolutely. And I think this GM crops technology is one really good example of that. But you can also think of other issues such as malaria and tuberculosis, and many of those infectious diseases kill literally millions of people. And then vitamin deficiency, just vitamin A deficiency alone kills about 500,000 children today, every year, and another 250,000 go blind every year. And so there are a lot of tools developed through biotechnology, and these are not necessarily relevant to United States or in Europe, But if you're living in Bangladesh or in Nigeria, they can mean a lot. It can mean a difference between life and death. And so I think there is a certain moral responsibility on the part of those of us who live in the West and who have benefited tremendously from science and technology, now that we should not be closing doors on continued innovation of these technologies. So those, especially those less fortunate, can also benefit from them.
Yeah, for people who don't know, what are some of the most popular examples of these genetic crops? Like you talk a lot about BT eggplant. There's the golden rice. These different fortified crops that you just alluded to that have all the. What are some other common ones?
Right. I think golden rice is an excellent example. It was something that was developed, over 20 years ago in a laboratory at Switzerland in collaboration with scientists at International Rice Research Institute in Philippines. They did a lot of testing of these. And what this does is golden rice has genes from maize, a couple of genes from maize. And so just like the maize, the corn kernels have yellow color, and that is because of the beta carotene antioxidant in that, which is converted into vitamin A in your body. So this golden rice appears golden in color simply because it has an extra vitamin A precursor that none of the regular rice varieties has. And so if farmers are allowed to grow this variety, and if consumers have access to this, it can really help addressing the vitamin A deficiency problem that I alluded to. And yet, not a single farmer in the world is able to grow golden rice, not because of any safety concerns or anything. It's simply because of politics. It's simply because of the relentless attack on this technology and then golden rice perpetrated by activists such as Greenpeace, the governments such as in Philippines and in Bangladesh, where it's almost ready, it's all ready to go, have still not allowed their farmers to grow because of the activist attack or the problems that they have with activists and even the media too.
Right. One other interesting thing you tweeted about the other day was this movie Percy. I believe Christopher Walken stars as this gentleman, the farmer from Saskatchewan, Percy Schmeiser. And this is the funny thing about the tweet was that they had to change the cover because they had the wrong crop on the cover. It was corn instead of canola.
Right. I think there was a lot of things wrong about it. Percy Schmeiser was a farmer in Saskatchewan in Canada who was found to be growing to almost 2,000 acres of a GM crop that he had not paid for. It's like trying to use a software on your computer that you're simply, just stolen from a source and you're not paid for it. And so the Monsanto company that had the patents for those varieties of GM crop that he was growing took him to the court, and then the court decided against him. Usually this is something that the companies have tended to ignore because the amount of piracy that goes on is not that big, and there's a lot of negative publicity that comes along with it. But in this case, this was a very brazen misappropriation of the intellectual property right, and so they went after that, and then he kind of became a hero to the anti-biotech groups because it kind of fits into the narrative of David versus Goliath, in a way that, he was a small farmer, the big multinational company went after him. So it makes a very nice narration, and it really helped them in trying to malign this technology and to malign the companies such as Monsanto as being evil. But in actual reality, it's, his court case, the Canadian court system looked at all the evidence and heard all people from both sides and decided against him. And yet that factor was not brought in very clearly into the movie, because the movie was clearly one-sided, and it is not a factual representation of what happened.
So devil's advocate, what was his side of the story anyways? Was it something about their seeds flew into his
Right.
thing and he didn't know they were there? And
Exactly. He said, no, he didn't know that. He said it was just the pollen from the neighboring fields just came in, the seeds, just came into his, and then just planted that. And, that happens when because the winds do blow the pollen, and the winds do blow the seeds, and it happens, but usually that is a small contamination of your field. But if you're planting 2,000 acres and every one of your plant turns out to be positive for this particular variety, and then the companies do come after you. And it's not just because it was a GM crop. There is even if you're an organic farmer and you're growing an organic variety from a company, and that you're simply stolen their seeds, and if you plant it, the company will come after you. And so it's like anything else in this world.
right. Speaking of CRISPR, there are other ways it can be used as well, not just in food security, but also you tweeted about this COVID-19 test in India that is very cheap and the results come within an hour. How does that work, or what is the story around that?
Right. And again, Indians were not the first to use CRISPR to develop the COVID test. In fact, the co-inventor of CRISPR, called Dr. Zhang at MIT, developed one of the very first protocols for using CRISPR technology in detecting a COVID virus. And they made that kit and the technology freely available for anybody to use in the world. But I think what is unique about this Indian group from that they announced a couple of days ago was that the prototype or the proof of concept was something along the lines of a pregnancy test. They embedded the whole system on a piece of paper, and you could just dip that into the sample solution, and then within a very short time, depending on changing of the color, you can detect whether it is COVID positive or COVID negative with a fair amount of certainty. And at a
Sorry,
very low
what is the way that they what is the method that they test?
Right, they use CRISPR. See, CRISPR is a technology that uses what we call is a piece of RNA called guide RNA to latch on to a piece of DNA, and then it changes the code that changes to one or two nucleotides, and that's how we do it, gene editing. So it's kind of like, think of it as your iPhone. When you're texting me, it just makes the auto correction of the spellings. You see, or you could use a spelling corrector to make a deliberate correction of the mistakes that you make in your letters. In the same way, the CRISPR, we can use the technology to make small changes in the genetic sequence. But because it uses that matching system, we can also use that or repurpose the CRISPR system into genetic detection system, not necessarily to change something, because there is the guide RNA and the DNA, they try to attach themselves based on the sequences. And so they use this CRISPR guide RNA system essentially to see if the sample has COVID, then you would develop a positive attachment of that RNA with DNA, and through some coloring system, they could detect that positive attachment.
Right. So it still would be a swab, but if you know what you're looking for, you use the CRISPR to sort of match that up. And if it makes a match, then that's
right.
How the results come so quickly. So how do the results work now? Like if a test in COVID, a regular COVID test takes whatever it is, 24, 48, 72 hours. What is the method currently that we use?
The current method we use is called PCR. It's a polymerase chain reaction method. Mm-hmm. What it was a technique that was developed by a guy working for a company called Cetus. His name is Carey Mullis. It was developed in the 80s. It also uses a similar system where instead of guide RNA, what they use is small synthetic pieces of DNA that have been constructed in the lab, where they throw in into the sample and they tries to attach into those sequences where it finds a match. And so what they do is they try to throw in two sequences at either end of the gene that you want to detect, and then in the laboratories they amplify it using certain enzymes, and that goes through a series of steps by which you can detect whether there is a positive hit or not. In other words, let's say if you're looking for a COVID gene within the sample, this PCR would literally amplify the gene millionfold in the sample using this method, and the DNA would be in large enough quantities that it could be detected. And so this is the gold standard, the PCR technique, but it's also extremely sensitive. Sometimes even it is prone to throwing false positives too.
Right.
And you may have a very, very low viral load. And because this is such a sensitive technique, it could still pick up. And PCR, for instance, is the tool that is used in DNA fingerprinting, for instance, to catch the criminals and in paternity cases. And it's something it's used in all forms of DNA identification.
Right. So CRISPR method may be much quicker, much more effective. And what is the average time, since COVID started, has the time for your test results on average in the United States, for example, gotten any quicker, or is it you still have to wait a little bit for it?
No, yes, it takes about 15 minutes. I think the one that President Trump got tested, he used the newer antigen technique that has come about by Abbott Labs. And that takes about 15 minutes. And from what I hear, I haven't seen the complete details of the Indian method that you're talking about, but it also takes about 15 or 20 minutes, but it's much cheaper. It only costs about like $5 or something like that. And so the idea is, if you have a very large scale and very rapid and fairly reliable technique, then it could be used. Like you see, and I could use that practically in my every class to make sure every student that I'm teaching in person is negative, and we could use that while you are loading, while you're for the aircrafts, for instance, for all the passengers that could be screened. So you can see that we could deploy it at a very large scale to bring back certain normalcy and to end the lot of lockdown that we still have all over the world.
Right, especially waiting for second waves and that sort of thing.
Right, it's quite disturbing.
Speaking of Trump and policy for a moment, I didn't know this, but I realized that Trump signs a lot of executive orders, and I don't know their efficacy. But in 2019, he did sign an executive order modernizing the regulatory framework for agriculture biotech products. Now, if you're familiar with that, which I assume you are, was this effective? Is it just for pro-business? Is it actually pro-biotech? Does it actually help?
I think it's pro-science. It's one of those, I think, executive decisions or the executive order that President Trump promulgated that I personally support because, you see, biotechnology regulation developed in an ad hoc manner, a kind of hodgepodge over time. And we have three agencies that oversee biotechnology products regulation. If you develop a genetically modified crop, and if that is food, like corn or soybean that we eat, then the FDA gets into the regulatory role. And if if that happens to be a product that also is resistant to pests, like the BT corn, then the EPA gets into the action, the Environmental Protection Agency. And also, in most of these cases, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is a primary regulator. And so each of them have their own regulatory rules that we need to look up. But also, there are three independent agencies with almost no coordination between them. And so this executive order simply brings them under a single umbrella and tries to make it easier. I don't think it compromises our safety in any manner.
Hmm.
I think it's far more science-based and just makes it more streamlined.
So when we say it makes it easier, streamlined, is it just in for time, or is it actually, like you mentioned, it doesn't make it less safe? So are there less hurdles they have to get over, or is it more of a speeding up?
I think it's both. I think he has challenged, the executive order challenges these agencies to come up with a more streamlined system that over time, that it would make it not just easier for those who are applying for a permit and approvals that they could commercialize their product, but also to you see right now what's happening is it just takes about 100 to 150 million dollars in expense to get a GM crop approved through all these agencies, and it takes anywhere from 7 to 10 years. And the fact of the matter is, because the regulatory system is so onerous and so burdensome, only very big players like big multinational companies would have the financial wherewithal to get their products into the market.
Right.
Smaller players like the public sector universities, including ours, have really do not have the resource. And much of this regulation was put in place in the 80s, where we did not know much about biotechnology and genetic engineering and its risks. Now, in hindsight, we know a lot about it, and we do recognize many of our initial fears were unfounded. And so it is time to make this regulation more in line with the scientific knowledge that we have, and also make sure we will open up in such a manner that it levels the playing field.
Right. So tonight we have the vice presidential debates,
Mhm.
and this may air just after that happens. But is there anything at stake for the biotech world, policy-wise, for this election, or is it going to be okay either way? Or are there any major things that we're focusing on?
Right. I think as far as agricultural biotechnology is concerned, I don't think matters much. Uh, as far as I'm concerned, whether Republicans come back or with Democrats get into the seat, because they are both are fairly well supportive of this technology. In the past 20, 25, 30 years, it has been both Republican and Democratic administrations have supported it. But in medical biotech, I think there are some issues where the democratic governments have favored, for instance, stem cell technology, where Republicans have put some hurdles on that in the beginning, at least. But at the end of the day, I don't think it matters a great deal. But what's interesting footnote here is Kamala Harris. Her mother, like me, came from India
Mm-hmm.
to do her PhD here at Cal Berkeley. And she was a molecular biologist. She was a scientist who worked on GMOs and using genetic modification technology in treating cancer. And she was a very well-known cancer researcher who later moved to McGill University and did much of her research over there. And she passed away a few years ago. And so from that point of view, I have a feeling Miss Kamala Harris would have a little probably personal familiarity with this technology than Mike Pence. But Mike Pence has been equally very supportive of this technology.
Interesting. So we also just had the great guitar player Eddie Van Halen pass away, and I know you've got a lot of humor on Twitter, but I have to say I think it's a little too soon. But you posted a meme that said bok choy, like BACH choy, and then Elvis Parsley, and your contribution was Eddie Van Halen. Don't you think that's a little too soon, sir?
Oh, I know, but it was no disrespect to the great guitarist. It was something that a lot of music fans were upset, and I don't think I mocked him in any manner. It's just that it was a little meme that I picked up where a lot of famous musicians names that rhymed with vegetables were put.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought that, and there's one other thing that also I like was John Lemon.
John Lemon. No, I thought
Yeah.
it was great. I kid. I think it was a great tribute there. How
Thank
else
you.
have you found social media? How has your social media journey been? Have you? What are the pros and cons? And how long have you been using Twitter to promote science and talk about this stuff?
Right. I think I've been both Twitter and Facebook. I've been for about 10 years now. But before that, I used to run a newsletter, uh, and I used to run a website called Ag Bio World, which is, which I don't run anymore because much of all my time I spend on the social media.
Mm.
And so that's why my Twitter handle and Facebook handle, science handle, is still Ag Bio World, because it's kind of carry over from my days where I used to run that website. And I used to run a daily newsletter where essentially I was encapsulating some of the daily news on biotechnology, and also had the readers were were sending me comments. It was like the pre-social media discussion board. And once the social media started taking off, I moved into this. And today, like last month, I reached about 8 million people, which is really amazing, because I sit in this small town here in Alabama, and I have my day job, and yet the evening few hours that I spend on this, I'm able to reach a lot of people that I could not have imagined doing that in the pre-social media time. And so it has been a good journey for me, because it keeps me intellectually occupied, to make sure I read up on the science, and also to help bring that in a manner that the society can understand, into that, and with, of course, peppered with humor and memes that you have already noted.
Yeah, I think you use it in a good way in that it's a tool that if you get involved in, say, controversy or that kind of or negative Twitter verses, then you will attract that as well. But if you put out positivity and humor and knowledge, then you typically get the same thing back, probably.
That's right. I think it's been very positive. I still occasionally get people, who don't agree with me, and I try to engage them whenever I can. But there are some that who are really not interested in engaging me to in terms of science or reason or fact. They just want to troll, and and those, in some instances like that, it's counterproductive to get into a drawn out argument. So which I just don't indulge in that.
Right. You're familiar with Patrick Moore, the Greenpeace
Yeah. Mhm.
guy? I know he
Right. I've known him
follows
for a
you.
long time.
Yeah, and I could never put my finger on what is this guy's deal, because he calls himself the sensible environmentalist, but he said he was a founder of Greenpeace, but then Greenpeace said he wasn't. But wasn't Greenpeace originally like a loose collective? It wasn't really like a
Right.
organization at first, but
He was amongst the founders of Greenpeace when it was really a bunch of hippies,
Mhm.
going around and trying to protest nuclear reactors and things of that nature in Canada.
Right.
And then he went on to get his PhD in forest ecology from British Columbia. And then he and Greenpeace parted their ways, and then he went on to become a kind of an activist on his own, and he's been very, very greatly supportive of agricultural biotechnology and the science behind it. But one of the places where he gets into problem is he's also a big denier of global warming, and that's get into a lot of his his problems come from his very strong position against global climate change, which I think in the increasing evidence that we have seen in the past 20 years now, we do recognize that there is a global climate change, and there is a very strong likelihood that some of this global climate change is caused by human beings. And so and I think in science, you can have your ideological position, but when you're faced with evidence, you must be allowed to, you must change your mind. And that's how the science works. And so if there is an overwhelming evidence that something is not as you had always thought, then you need to change your position, move on.
Right. I gotta say, it seems like it's a difficult task when we say there's overwhelming evidence of something. We keep repeating that, whereas the scientists know what that means because they can chew on the data and figure it out and look at the
Right.
models and that. But the average person has their tendencies, their political leanings and whatnot, and they get clouded sort of by, I don't want to necessarily say lack of knowledge almost.
Right.
How does the average person digest when we say there's an overwhelming evidence of something?
It's not easy, whether it's global climate change or even now, even more of relevant interest is vaccines, the safety of vaccines. As you know, there's quite a sizable group of people, including President Trump at one time, although he's now a big talks about vaccines every day. He was an anti-vaxxer.
Yeah.
Right? There are a lot of famous people who are opposed to vaccines. Robert De Niro comes to mind. And so there is, again, when you talk about scientific consensus, I mean, you could have even scientists who may not agree with you. But on the other hand, the science is a process where, the experts look at the evidence, and then the evidence, as you know, again, changes every day, and the scientific opinion might change. But currently, with all the evidence that we have on the vaccines, we know they are safe, and the small amount of risk that they bring is when you balance it against the overwhelming benefits that they bring to the society, that the risk is very, very small and insignificant, and so that is how the scientific consensus is, and it's the same with the global warming, and it's the same when it comes to the safety of the GM crops. At this point in time, this is what it is.
Right.
And I can understand for a common person it is difficult, and at the same time, what has happened with this social media trend is that each of us, we are kind of sucked into our ideological groups that we want to believe they are more aligned with our beliefs. So we get trapped into this echo chambers in social media, and that is what has led to this deep polarization on many of these topics in the society today.
Yeah, it also seems that 2020 has been the poster child for not understanding science or keeping up with it, because we have the WHO and the CDC with different information all the time, which logically it seems that we have to take it day by day, as the scientists do, as they see the evidence and they analyze it. They'll tell us what the most recent finding is, but it seems there has been some points along the way globally with COVID that we are hearing different opinions, and again, the average person gets confused and they think, well, the WHO or the CDC must not know what they're doing, where in reality they've probably had a lot of training and academia that goes into it, and that more or less they probably know what they're doing. Maybe there's a communications error that we're experiencing.
Right, and also most people may not recognize that in science, we there is never a certainty. There is always a certain element of uncertainty there, and that the scientists argue and fight all the time over certain issues. And when when a general public sees science in action, they might see something like it might come across as a very strong discordance between the scientists. But really, in reality, this is how the scientific consensus builds up, or where we look at the evidence, we argue over the merits of each of these, and over time the scientific consensus develop. But what is with COVID is it is so new, and then the information is coming at a very rapid stage, but still it is so new, and we still don't know a lot about it, and that's what it is. And when the scientists are very honest about it, sometimes the general public tends to doubt their expertise. But in reality, the scientists are, simply being honest. It's like, we were thinking about how the coronavirus is transmitted earlier, like on the surface, we used to
Right. It
There's a lot
started
of
with
washing.
24 hours, 48 hours, then that went
Yes,
down to a few hours. And the latest is the 6 feet versus 8 feet droplets
right,
and this kind of thing, where obviously
exactly,
it's probably, again, it should be logical that, okay, it's not always going to be 6 feet. It's going to be
right.
4, 5, 6, 7, right?
Exactly, and as the new information comes along and more research is done on it, our knowledge gets better and better, and so that's what it is.
Like, for example, with SARS, let's say, um,
Mhm.
have we figured out everything about SARS at this point? Are there still things that we're crunching data on about SARS? Like, how long will it take for the world to fully understand COVID? With a large degree, like, do you think it's a 5, 10 year thing, 20-year thing? I mean, it's hard to know for sure.
I'm really not a biomedical scientist, and so
Yeah.
my knowledge on this is just again as much as many other people. From again, when you look at historically, many of these diseases have had a very long lag. It just not go away very quickly, and even with our tremendous uh, force that we are putting onto this in terms of the scientific uh, work that we are doing, in terms of all the vaccines we are developing, many of these tend to have take their own time. And when you look at it, even now, AIDS, we don't have a vaccine for
Right.
HIV, and so and when Ebola, while it was quite a very horrible disease that just came on board a few years ago, and it's still not been uh, extinguished. We still don't have a vaccine against it, and there's a lot of diseases that keeps coming back, and so it's very likely that even with vaccine coming along against COVID, this is going to be in our midst for some time.
Speaking of time and time horizons, when we look at agricultural biotech and CRISPR and these different technologies, what do you see in the time horizon for, say, 50, 100, 500 years? Are there things that are unrealistic that will not happen? And are there things that we maybe can't imagine today, but they may be possible in,
Mhm.
say, 500 years, something like that?
Yes, as what they say about trying to guess, predicting the future,
Well,
right?
neither of us will be here to know if we got it right, so we might as well just guess.
Right. Yeah, I might as well look at the crystal ball. But I do believe that, I cannot tell what would happen, but what I can tell is the science will find a way for many of the problems that we are facing today. Whether it is our reliance on fossil fuels, for instance, uh, I'm sure probably in 20, 30 years from now, the use of petroleum, reliance on petroleum and natural gas, all of that would probably be history. We might have a new source of energy that we may not even thought of today. You
Mm.
see what I mean? And so it's the same with the global warming. Along with that, some of the issues with the global warming might be taken care of too. And it's the same with the biomedical science. The research, the science is advancing so rapidly, powered by all these innovations such as CRISPR, for instance, that we are getting a very effective handle on many of the physiological diseases, including cancer, diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and many that of them have a very strong genetic component, and we may be able to do something about it. And it's the same thing with the food too. We are a world now with 7.5 billion people. We're probably going to stabilize at 9 billion people, but still there's a lot of people, and for the food has to be grown somewhere. And I am pretty confident, uh, 30, 40, 50 years from now, the kind of food production that we're going to indulge is going to be vastly different from what we do today. It's going to be far more sustainable. It's going to be having a less footprint on the natural resources, air, water, and soil, and everything. It's going to be less polluting, and the food is going to be far more nutritious, flavorsome, and less toxins and allergens than what we have today. And all of these things are possible. Is right now the technology is showing the way, and we may not be able to apply much fertilizer and pesticides in growing our food. And maybe much of the meat may be grown in the lab, and so there's quite a lot of transformational changes that we already seen happening in the agriculture system today. It's going to impact how we're going to grow and consume food in the future.
So you think we've really just sort of scratched the surface as far as history goes with this technology? Is that
Yeah,
fair to say?
certainly. I mean, in the whole of human history of agriculture, we have we have practiced agriculture for the last 10,000 years, which is again a very small spectrum. We've been alive for up 200,000 years, and it's very small. And within that, the biotechnology is only been with us only for the last 25 years. But this is a game-changing technology that is already affecting how we do our medicine, how we do our forensics, for instance, and how we are developing new crops and livestock. Looking forward, I would think that 21st century is going to be defined as the century of biology that profoundly made a difference in the lives of people in many unforeseen ways, improve the health, improve the environment, and improve the food production and the quality of life overall. All of this, I think, would be made possible with the smart use of biotechnology, with all the other innovations that are coming along, including the computational biology that is helping us to do so many things that we could not have imagined even 5 years ago.
Right. It's amazing stuff. Very incredible stuff. Dr. Prakash, I want to thank you for your time once again. And if you guys want to follow this social media influencer on Twitter, it is at AGBioWorld. Give him a follow and send him a nice message. And anything else you want to direct people to? Any websites other than your Twitter handle, or?
I think my Twitter handle and lot of people that whom I tend to interact with, including Kevin Folta and his podcast, have a lot of useful information. And so, what I want to tell your audience is to trust science and trust scientists. It's not that we are right all the time, but at least we have a system of correcting ourselves if we are wrong. And so
100%.
over time, we tend to own up to our mistakes and tend to improve over time, and that's how science works. And I'm sure by believing in science and by trying to look towards objective source of information, your audience would be able to make informed decisions themselves.
Well, I appreciate it very much, and we definitely are pro-science here at the Deekast show. And yes, and shout out to Dr. Kevin Folta as well. Maybe we'll have both of you guys on here one day. That could be pretty cool.
Awesome.
Okay, thanks again for your time, and have fun watching the debates.
Thank you, Derek. I enjoyed talking to you.
We'll talk to you later. See ya.
Goodbye.